Here's our sixth essay outline on the topic of terrorism. For more information on what I think should be part of an essay outline, or at least the structure that I'll be following, please refer to the first video in this module. Terrorism is quite a niche topic, so there aren't really that many questions, but some questions worth considering are: can we ever eliminate terrorism, and can terrorism ever be justified? So for today, we're going to go through, can we ever eliminate terrorism? And this video is based on an essay outline from a friend who doesn't want to be named. So first, we need to check that we know what terrorism is about. This is the definition. Violent acts that are intended to create fear, which are perpetrated for a religious, political, or ideological goal, and deliberately target or disregard the safety of non-combatants. So 3 elements of terrorism here. We need to keep in mind that terrorism doesn't just refer to extremist Islamic jihad, which is the most common and high-profile kind of terrorism that the layman knows about. Now let's do some deeper question analysis. Can we ever eliminate terrorism? Both of these terms are absolute. This phrasing thus calls for us to prove that we can never ever rid the world of terrorism completely, perhaps even in the future. So this is kind of our argumentative crux, and we need to start thinking about how we're going to decide how to answer yes or no to this question, what our yardstick is. We're going to do so by looking at the structural features of terrorism and compare or perhaps pit these structural features against existing or potential future counter-terrorist measures. So brainstorming of points. Reasons why we might be able to eliminate terrorism. We could say there have been significant improvements in investigative and offensive technology that have enabled us to better defend against terrorism. We could say that with improved regional and international cooperation, surely in the future governments should be able to rid the world of terrorism. So the point about technology and a point about cooperation amongst different countries. Reasons why we cannot eliminate terrorism. Ultimately, it's a war of hearts and minds. So even if we eliminate some of the terrorists themselves, the movement lives on. Next, terrorism is difficult to define, which makes it further difficult to eliminate. And finally, terrorism prevails because of online anonymity and freedom, which makes it very difficult to eradicate. Basically, there is widespread accessibility of the internet and interconnectivity through the internet. So we need to choose points. We have 5, so technically we could write all. However, this point here, I think, is a bit too idealistic and potentially too speculative. It's very difficult to substantiate this with real-world facts and reasoning. And it's so idealistic, it definitely requires a counter-argument of some kind, which would mean that the essay would get too long. It'll end up being like 6 paragraphs. And also it will be too much time, too many words spent on this idea of cooperation. So we go with the other 4 points. That's enough for a decent essay. Let's check that we have examples for each of these points. On the point about improvements in technology, well, Navy SEALs use informants and bugging technology to find Osama bin Laden's hiding place, and drone strikes in Yemen, according to US authorities, kill 30 plus terrorists every year. So that's bugging technology, drone strikes. Why we cannot eliminate? How terrorism is a war of hearts and minds? Well, they killed several Al-Qaeda leaders, but it still sprouted decentralized appendages in other countries. Terrorism being difficult to define. The Free Syrian Army is a terrorist group under Assad's definition, but to the rest of the world they are considered freedom fighters. Another point about the internet and online anonymity. Well, the Boston bomber was radicalized from Al-Qaeda websites on how to make bombs. This is the Boston bombing at that marathon a few years ago. Now, our sequencing of points is fairly straightforward. We put our counter-argument first about significant improvements in investigative and offensive technology. Then we put the rest of our reasons for why terrorism is so difficult to eliminate. Now for our mini introduction. The context we set out. Terrorism incites wide-scale panic year after year, from the death throes of 9/11 to the chaos of Russian separatists to the Sierra Leone civil war, etc., etc. You can tell stories and show how terrorism is a pertinent issue that threatens global security today. Now, for our crux, we should mention and show that we understand that it's difficult to say with certainty that we can or cannot ever eliminate terrorism. So we address that connotation, that implication in the wording of the question. And then our thesis. Significant improvements in investigative and offensive technology have furthered counter-terrorist efforts, but they are not sufficient to address some inherent structural features of terrorism. It would thus be very difficult or near impossible to eliminate. So we acknowledge our counter-argument and show how, despite that counter-argument, we still take this stance. So for the first paragraph, point, significant improvements in investigative and offensive technology have enabled us to better defend against terrorism. Explanation, especially since 9/11, the world has stepped up efforts to counter terrorism. We're always developing new technology and methods to track down terrorists and eliminate threats. And more countries are joining in such efforts to crack down on terrorism. So an example is the Navy SEALs using informants and bugging technology to find Osama bin Laden's hiding place, and drone strikes, which are obviously conducted by high technology drones which kill terrorists. You can even think about like airport screening measures, like security at borders, and how all of that contributes to this fight against terrorism by using technology. So link, therefore, our chances of one day eliminating terrorism are improving. So this whole paragraph is kind of saying, yeah, we might one day be able to eliminate terrorism. There's a chance of that happening. It's difficult for us to come up with any paragraph that says, yes, we can definitively one day eliminate terrorism. But this is good enough to be considered a counter-argument. Second paragraph, why we cannot eliminate terrorism. I'll lead on. However, these measures are inadequate because despite such improvements, terrorism still exists. And the reason for this, or one of them, is that ultimately terrorism is a war of hearts and minds. So we can eliminate some terrorists, but the movement lives on. Explanation. The people themselves are replaceable. New leaders can rise, more terrorists can be recruited because at its foundation is an ideology, which is not a physical, tangible thing. Beliefs can spread easily and be very powerful sources of motivation for action, i.e., killing and terrorist actions. So example, the killing of several Al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, destroyed the group's leadership, but the group thereafter sprouted decentralized appendages in Yemen, North Africa, and Syria. Another example, the US killed Al-Qaeda in Iraq's charismatic leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in 2006, but the group he led actually morphed into what we now call ISIS. Now that is pretty scary. Further elaboration. It's especially pernicious when it taps into a racial component, because there is a never-ending stream of people willing to fight when they feel a core part of their identity, which is their race, is under assault. Example, homegrown terrorists like the Uyghurs in China. This Muslim minority group feels marginalized and constantly fights back. So some further reasons why the terrorists being killed doesn't mean that terrorism itself is killed off. Groups may not even mourn the losses of their members or leaders if their core belief is that dying for the cause is the goal. The jihad belief is that one is assured of a place in heaven if one kills non-believers in the process of himself dying. Assassinated leaders may even become martyrs and help groups to recruit more to their cause. In fact, one of the reasons why drone strikes are so controversial is that oftentimes civilians are killed in the process by accident, collateral damage. But because of that, more ordinary citizens take up arms against the West, and they resent the West for the drone strikes and for all this stuff. And so such people actually become more easily recruited to terrorist groups. So at present, the world has few ways of addressing the root causes of terrorism, i.e. the ideologies and the beliefs, or perhaps the persecution and poverty that mobilize people to extreme action. Thus, it seems it would be extremely difficult to eliminate terrorism. Next, terrorism is difficult to define, which makes it harder to eliminate. How do we distinguish between an organization legally protesting against the government and a violent terrorist organization? Do we distinguish by looking at their cause? Well, whether a cause can be considered terrorist is subjective because, depending on the cause, public opinion may be on their side even if they're committing violent acts, and so therefore the cause might be considered justified and not so-called terrorist. Do we distinguish such organizations by looking at their means. Well, when is a group fighting for the sake of inciting fear, which would be terrorism? Or when is a fear produced simply a byproduct of a just war? Then our example of the Free Syrian Army is relevant here. We say it's thus very difficult to agree on the definitions of terrorism and take action. And to further illustrate this, the UN Convention on Elimination of Terrorism couldn't even agree on the definition of terrorism, on the line between freedom fighters and terrorists. So we've explained why terrorism is difficult to define. Why is that a problem? Well, officials hesitate to crack down, and it gives these groups time to gain popular support and traction. An example is Hezbollah in the West Bank, which you can read up more about on your own. Finally, terrorism prevails because of online anonymity and freedom, which makes it very difficult to eradicate. Some ways in which terrorists use the internet to get around. Well, they can reroute internet connection around a few IP servers to disguise their locations. They can digitally code their messages to make sure they won't make sense, even if the message is intercepted by law enforcement, which means that they can communicate across countries without fear of being caught. They use social media to recruit and spread beliefs across borders, and there is widespread accessibility of information on how to make bombs and create terror, or even information that could radicalize people to a terrorist cause. And here the Boston bomber example comes in. So I'll link. The internet makes it easy for terrorists to communicate, plan, and spread information secretly. Government efforts to monitor and intervene are never foolproof, making terrorism hard to eliminate. Conclusion. We reiterate our stance. Existing measures are insufficient to eliminate terrorism entirely, given some of its structural elements. A huge change in status quo would be required. Thus, eliminating terrorism is a far-flung prospect at the moment. Especially since terrorism is so complex, there are so many different groups with different causes, ideologies, methods, it's highly unlikely we could ever eradicate all of it entirely. New forms are constantly always emerging. When terrorism evolves, counterterrorism evolves to match it, and vice versa. This is the nature of any long drawn-out war. Neither side wins all the battles all the time. So it's difficult to say we can eradicate terrorism once and for all. We can only do our best to fight against it and defend the rest of the world as much as possible. So the question was, can we ever eliminate terrorism? Our answer isn't really no. It's definitely not yes, for sure. Our answer is it's highly unlikely that this is something that can happen for all these reasons. And that is a valid answer to the question. We do answer the question, especially since, if you remember in the introduction, we point out the fact that it's near impossible to say yes or no definitively to this question. That's all for this essay outline. Hope it was useful and interesting. See you next time.